the man who painted Hollywood's face, and the corporations that erased him. There is a building on North Highland Avenue in Hollywood that tourists occasionally photograph without knowing why they're drawn to it. For stories of Art Deco architecture, pink and blue terracotta tiles arranged in geometric patterns that catch the California light at certain angles and seem almost to glow. A facade so deliberately beautiful that it looks less like a commercial building than like a statement, the physical embodiment of someone's conviction that making people beautiful was work serious enough to deserve a serious address. The building has been empty for years. Security fencing surrounds it. The windows are dark. A developer bought it in 2014 and announced plans for a boutique hotel. Nothing happened. Another developer bought it in 2018 and announced mixed-use creative offices. Nothing happened. The Art Deco tiles are accumulating the particular grime of neglect, not dramatic decay. Just the slow dulling of something that was once brilliant. Inside, somewhere beneath layers of abandonment, are the rooms. The blonde room, the brunette room, the redhead room, each decorated entirely in shades of a single color, walls, furniture, drapery, lighting, designed so that a cosmetician could evaluate a client's skin tone against the most revealing possible backdrop and prescribe products with scientific precision. The rooms where Rita Hayworth sat, where Judy Garland was transformed, where the faces that define 20th century beauty were studied and perfected by a man who had been thinking about this exact problem since he was 8 years old in Russian Poland. This is where Max Factor built his empire. This is where it ended. And the distance between those two facts is one of the most instructive stories in the history of American business, not because it's unusual, but because it's so perfectly, painfully representative of what happens when corporations acquire something they cannot understand and manage it until there is nothing left to manage. A pharmacist's apprentice in the Pale of Settlement. Maksymilian Faktorowicz was born in 1877 in Bough, a textile manufacturing city in what was then the Russian Empire's territory of Congress, Poland. He was one of 10 children in a family that existed in the specific precarity of Jewish life, in the Pale of Settlement, not destitute, but subject to the restrictions and periodic violence that defined existence for millions of Jews. In the Russian Empire's western borderlands. At 8 years old, he was apprenticed to a local pharmacist. This was a common arrangement for Jewish boys of limited means. Pharmacy was one of the few trades accessible without navigating the discriminatory guild structures that blocked other skilled work. What made this particular apprenticeship unusual was that the pharmacist also supplied theatrical makeup to the Watt Opera House and to traveling theater companies passing through a city wealthy enough to support professional entertainment. The boy who was supposed to be learning to compound medicines was simultaneously learning to compound cosmetics. He learned pigment chemistry and color theory. He learned how different skin tones absorbed and reflected light differently. He learned that grease paint designed for gaslight theaters looked grotesque in daylight, and that solving this problem required understanding both the chemistry of the product and the physics of the light it would be seen under. By the time he was 14, he had left the pharmacy and begun working for a wig maker and theatrical costumer. By 18, he had saved enough to open his own shop in Watt, wigs, theatrical supplies, and cosmetics that enhanced rather than masked, subtle enough that respectable women might actually use them. This last ambition was genuinely radical. In 1890s Poland, as in most of Europe, makeup was worn by actresses and prostitutes. The idea that cosmetics might be socially acceptable for ordinary women was not merely unconventional, it was scandalous. Faktorowicz was developing products that walked a line nobody had clearly defined. Enhancement without impropriety. Beauty that could not be obviously detected as artifice. This would become the founding philosophy of everything he built later. The Russian military conscripted him in his early 20s, assigning him as a barber and cosmetician to the Moscow Artillery Brigade. The posting came with an unexpected education. Moscow's Imperial Opera was receiving the first installations of electric stage lighting. which burned hotter and illuminated more harshly than the gas lamps they replaced. Every formula that had worked under gaslight failed under carbon arcs. The makeup melted, streaked, caked. Actors looked painted under the new lights in ways they hadn't before. Faktorowicz spent years solving this problem. He had access to Moscow's military chemists and the most demanding clients imaginable, opera performers, whose careers depended on how their faces read from the back of a large, brightly lit theater. He developed formulas that remained stable under intense heat, that moved naturally with facial expressions, that could be applied thin enough to read as natural skin rather than theatrical costume. When his service ended, he returned to Wadk with a wife, 2 children, and a collection of formulas that represented years of systematic experimentation. Under conditions no commercial cosmetics maker had ever faced, business was good. Then Russia began to collapse. The 1905 revolution, the escalating pogroms, the social instability following the disastrous war with Japan. These were not abstractions for Jewish families in Russian Poland. Faktorowicz heard about the Louisiana Purchase Exposition in St. Louis, where an immigrant might demonstrate products to an international audience. More importantly, he understood that America was a country without the Pale of Settlement, without laws restricting Jewish property ownership, without the particular combination of bureaucratic obstruction and episodic violence that had defined his entire life. In late 1904, he moved his family to America, traveling through Moscow to liquidate his remaining inventory, then east across Siberia, then by ship across the Pacific. They arrived in Missouri in time for the fair. The 7-month St. Louis exposition taught him 2 things. American theatrical makeup was technically inferior to what he could make, and the center of American entertainment was not St. Louis, was not even New York, but was rapidly becoming a dusty basin 3,000 miles west, where a new medium was being invented by men who had no idea what problems they were about to face. The problem that film didn't know it had Hollywood in 1909 was not yet Hollywood. It was a temperance community that had recently banned both movie production and alcohol within its borders. The film studios fleeing Thomas Edison's East Coast patent enforcement were settling in adjacent communities: Edendale, Culver City, the flatlands near downtown Los Angeles, drawn by reliable California light, cheap land, and the 3,000-mile buffer between themselves and Edison's lawyers. Faktorowicz, now calling himself Max Factor, the anglicized name more practical for American commerce, arrived in Los Angeles and opened a shop serving theatrical and early film clients. He was in his early 30s, starting over in a city that barely existed yet, in an industry that was still figuring out what it was. The film people had a problem they hadn't fully recognized as a problem. Orthochromatic film stock, the standard of the era, was highly sensitive to blue and violet wavelengths and nearly blind to red. Normal human skin tones, which contain significant red and yellow, photographed in strange, washed-out ways. Lips appeared to disappear. Warm-toned skin went gray. Any surface irregularity that the naked eye overlooked became a visible canyon. Under the camera's unforgiving documentation, the industry's solution was crude. Apply heavy white grease paint to create an even base, then redraw features using dark liner. The result looked grotesque in person and merely adequate on screen. Directors accepted it because they had seen nothing better. Audiences accepted it because they had no frame of reference. Factor had spent a decade solving a nearly identical problem for Russian theater. He understood that the solution was not better application of the wrong product, but a fundamentally different product, one formulated for the specific spectral sensitivity of film rather than for human visual perception from a distance. He didn't arrive with a marketing plan. He arrived with samples, which he gave to bit players and character actors, people low enough in the studio hierarchy to be willing to experiment with an unknown supplier's untested product. Those actors looked better on film than their colleagues. Cinematographers noticed. Directors noticed. Other actors started asking questions. By 1916, Without significant advertising and without formal sales infrastructure, Max Factor cosmetics were being used on virtually every major production in Los Angeles. The adoption was driven entirely by merit. The products solved a real technical problem, more effectively than anything else available. Factor's insight was that he wasn't selling vanity to film actors. He was selling competitive advantage to film studios. If your actors looked more naturalistic on screen than your competitors' actors, audiences responded to the difference even if they couldn't articulate why. He marketed accordingly, his advertising leading with professional endorsement, not beauty promises. This positioning did two things simultaneously. It gave him unassailable credibility with the film industry, and it made his products aspirational to the consumer market that was beginning to watch movies with something approaching religious devotion. If you used Max Factor, you were using what the stars used. You were one step closer to the world those faces inhabited, the temple on Highland Avenue in 1928. Max Factor purchased a lot at 1666 North Highland Avenue and commissioned architect S. Charles Lee, the man responsible for some of Los Angeles's most opulent movie palaces, to design a building that would serve as headquarters, salon, laboratory, and monument simultaneously. Lee gave him a 4-story Art Deco building whose exterior expressed the brand's dual identity, pink and cream terracotta suggesting femininity and beauty, the geometric precision suggesting science and expertise. The consultation salons on the ground floor were divided into color-coded rooms: the blonde room, the brunette room, the redhead room, each decorated entirely in shades of a single color, each designed to reveal exactly how products would look against a specific combination of hair and skin. Factor had developed a comprehensive color harmony theory, a systematic framework for understanding how hair color, skin tone, and eye color interacted, and which cosmetic combinations would work for which type. The color rooms operationalized this theory. The consultation was scientific. The experience was magical. The building opened in 1929, and Max Factor was 52 years old, 40 years into his career, and had just built what would become one of the most recognized commercial addresses in the city. The golden decades and the seeds of declineth 1930s delivered everything Factor had spent decades working toward. The company launched Society Makeup in 1931, a consumer line formulated specifically for daily life conditions rather than film production, designed for office light and street light rather than carbon arc studio lamps. The marketing copy was direct about the premise: the same expertise that made stars luminous on screen could make you luminous at your desk. It was aspirational without being delusional. Because the claim was true, pancake makeup followed in 1937, originally developed at the specific request of Warner Brothers for their early Technicolor productions, which required a foundation that wouldn't reflect the intense multi-bend lighting. In unpredictable ways, Factor spent months on the formula. The result was a water-activated, cream 2-powder foundation that provided even coverage, set its own finish, and remained stable under conditions that destroyed conventional products. When he introduced it to the consumer market in 1938, department stores sold out their initial inventory in days. Letters arrived from women across the country asking where they could find more. It became one of the best-selling cosmetic products in American history within 2 years, not because of advertising, but because it actually worked differently from anything else available. The Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences had already recognized Factor's contribution to cinema with a special award in 1929. By the late 1930s, his products appeared in the credits of major films. His name was as recognizable to American women as any film stars. He had accomplished something that almost no immigrant entrepreneur achieves. He had not merely succeeded in America, he had shaped what America looked like. Max Factor died in December 1938. At 61, having worked himself into irreparable health, he left behind a company with global distribution, genuine technical superiority, and a brand identity so powerful that it had shaped how an entire industry understood itself. His four sons, Davis, Frank, Sidney, and Louis, maintained what their father built. Revenue grew from several million in 1938 to more than 80 million by 1965. The company employed thousands. The brand was recognized in 70 countries. The Highland Avenue building remained a pilgrimage destination. Women planned trips to Los Angeles partly to visit the Max Factor salon, the way they might plan to see a famous theater or a celebrated restaurant. But they were maintaining, not innovating. And maintenance is a losing strategy in an industry that accelerates. The structural problem was visible by the early 1950s, even if the numbers hadn't yet confirmed it. The film industry that had made Max Factor essential was changing. The studio system, the network of long-term contracts and exclusive relationships that had given a single makeup supplier access to every major star, simultaneously was dissolving under antitrust pressure and the rise of independent production. Actors increasingly arrived on set as free agents, bringing their own makeup artists who used whatever products they preferred. The guaranteed pipeline between Max Factor's Highland Avenue laboratories and the faces on American movie screens was narrowing simultaneously. Revlon, founded by Charles Revson in 1932, was demonstrating that cosmetics competition was not fundamentally about technical superiority. It was about emotional resonance. Revson understood something the Factor brothers had never needed to understand. During their father's lifetime, women don't buy lipstick to solve a technical problem. They buy it to feel something. His 1952 campaign pairing a lipstick shade with the tagline Fire and Ice, suggesting simultaneously danger and glamour, warmth and control, generated more consumer response than any cosmetics advertising. Since the invention of the medium, Max Factor's marketing still spoke to professional expertise, used on Hollywood's greatest stars. Both were legitimate strategies, but expertise is a static claim. It says, we know more than others. It doesn't say, we understand you. It doesn't say, wearing this will change how you feel about yourself tonight. Revlon said that. Max Factor didn't know how to. Louis Factor, the youngest brother and the most marketing-minded of the four, pushed for a more aggressive consumer positioning. He wanted to expand beyond makeup into fragrance and skincare. He wanted advertising that spoke to aspiration rather than credentials. He wanted the company to pursue younger consumers who had no particular attachment to the Hollywood golden age that Max Factor's brand still referenced. The other brothers resisted. Their caution was reasonable. Diversification risked diluting the precision identity that had made the company great, but their comfort with the status quo would prove dangerous in a market that rewarded reinvention. The tension between what Louis wanted and what his brothers would permit never fully resolved. It just slowly became irrelevant as the family aged and the decision about the company's future shifted to a different question: who would own it next? In 1965, the Factor family sold to Norton Simon Incorporated, a conglomerate that managed consumer brands for cash flow rather than long-term value. The sale price was approximately $65 million. Every brother was in his 60s. None of their children had shown serious interest in running the company. The logic was sound. The consequences were not. The prestige destroyed. Norton Simon's strategy was straightforward and ultimately fatal. Maximize revenue through wider distribution. They moved Max Factor aggressively into mass-market channels, drugstores, discount retailers, supermarkets. Sales grew. The brand died, not immediately, not visibly at first, but when you place a prestige product next to discount shampoo and markdown candy, something irreversible happens to consumer perception. Department stores that had given Max Factor prime counter space began reassigning those positions to Estee Lauder and Clinique, brands that had obsessively protected their pricing and their distribution and still felt like something worth having. Max Factor was reassigned to the mass cosmetics section, adjacent to Maybelline. Below the eye-level shelf, Norton Simon understood they were trading long-term brand equity for short-term revenue. They made the trade anyway because they had quarterly earnings to report, and because Max Factor was one brand in a portfolio of dozens, and because the people making that decision would be managing different brands. By the time the consequences became visible, then the conglomerate carousel began. Norton Simon was acquired by Esmark in 1983. Esmark was acquired by Beatrice Foods in 1984. Max Factor, founded by a man who had spent his life obsessing over makeup chemistry, was now owned by the company that made Tropicana orange juice and Butterball turkey. In 1991, Procter & Gamble paid $1.5 billion to acquire the brand from Beatrice. What P&G could not be why P&G was one of the most admired companies in the world. Their operational systems, distribution networks, and consumer research capabilities were genuinely unmatched. They had built dominant brands in category after category through relentless product testing, systematic distribution, and marketing discipline. What nobody fully articulated at the time of the acquisition was that P&G's competencies were specifically suited to a category of products that Max Factor did not actually belong to. Tide laundry detergent competes on measurable functional performance. A detergent that cleans 3% better than its competitor will, over time, acquire more loyal customers. P&G's development process, exhaustive testing, incremental improvement, extended validation, is perfectly calibrated for this kind of competition. Invest enough in research, run enough panels, iterate enough times, and you can reliably produce the best performing detergent on the market. The logic is clean. The feedback loops are clear. Lipstick does not work this way. A lipstick that stays on for % longer does not automatically win market share. A foundation with measurably better coverage does not automatically become the product women reach for. Cosmetics compete on desire, on the feeling a product creates, the story a brand tells, the way a woman imagines herself when she considers using it. These are not problems that consumer research panels can solve. They require instinct, cultural fluency, and genuine emotional investment in the product category. The kind of investment that comes from people who grew up caring about this, who have opinions about it that predate any professional responsibility to have opinions about it. P&G had none of these things. They had brilliant chemists and sophisticated marketers. They could not manufacture desire. Their strategic diagnosis of Max Factor was technically correct. The brand needed repositioning. As a bridge product, priced between mass market and prestige, targeting women who wanted quality at accessible prices. This was a rational response to the data. It was also a prescription for mediocrity, for a brand that stood for nothing in particular and gave no one a compelling reason to choose it over the dozen alternatives competing. At the same price point, throughout the 1990s, P&G launched product after product under the Max Factor name. Some were genuinely competent. Lipfinity, introduced in 1999, was one of the first truly long-wearing lipstick formulas and found a real audience. But competent products without a coherent brand story are just items on a shelf. Women tried Lipfinity because it solved a practical problem. They didn't develop a relationship with Max Factor because of it. There was nothing to have a relationship with. The brand had stopped standing for anything specific enough to attach to. Meanwhile, the professional makeup market was being redefined by people who had the one thing P&G couldn't acquire: genuine credibility with working makeup artists. MAC Cosmetics, founded in Toronto in 1984, had been built entirely on the ground-level endorsement of professional artists who actually preferred the products. By the time P&G was trying to relaunch Max Factor's professional positioning in the mid-1990s, MAC had become the industry standard in fashion, editorial, and film. The credibility that Max Factor Sr. had earned by making genuinely superior products for Hollywood in 1914 had been transferred, through 40 years of corporate mismanagement, to a company that had done what Max Factor once did, started from nothing, focused obsessively on what professionals needed, and built outward from that foundation. In 2008, P&G hired Pat McGrath, then establishing herself as the most influential makeup artist working in fashion, the artist whose work defined the visual language of major runway seasons. As creative design director, her limited collections for Max Factor received genuine attention from beauty editors, who had largely written the brand off. But McGrath was a freelance contributor, not a true believer. Her identity was her own emerging label. P&G's institutional culture could not integrate what she represented, the irrational, passionate, deeply personal relationship with makeup that had made Max Factor worth building in the first place. She was a hired solution to a problem that couldn't be solved by hiring. By 2009, internal P&G documents classified Max Factor as non-core. They sold to Coty in 2010 for an estimated $300 million. One-fifth of what they had paid, after nearly 2 decades of investment, the destruction of over $1 billion in shareholder value, achieved by a company that could legitimately claim world-class management capabilities, applied to a brand they fundamentally could not understand and never genuinely tried to. What was actually lost? Business lessons embedded in the Max Factor story are real, but they risk reducing something more significant to a case study. What Max Factor built was not simply a profitable company. He built an entire language, the conceptual vocabulary through which modern cosmetics still understands itself. The idea that makeup should reveal rather than conceal. The systematic understanding of how different skin tones interact with different pigments. The principle that making someone beautiful is a professional skill requiring genuine expertise, not a retail transaction requiring only a shelf and a price tag. The conviction that the relationship between a woman and her cosmetics is personal enough to deserve a real consultation. Every prestige beauty brand operating today speaks this language. MAC, founded in 1984 by a Toronto makeup artist, Bobbi Brown, launched on the principle that women wanted to look like themselves, only better. Pat McGrath Labs, built on decades of editorial credibility. All of them articulate their value in terms that Max Factor invented, mostly without knowing where those terms came from or what it cost to develop them. The company that invented this language lost its claim to it through 25 years of ownership by companies that never understood what they possessed. Each made decisions that were rational within their own frameworks. The rationality is precisely the point. You cannot preserve something exceptional by being rational about it. Rationality optimizes toward the average. Exceptional things exist at the edge of what rationality would recommend. Max Factor Sr. was not rational. He threw out batches that met reasonable standards because they didn't meet his standards. He spent years developing formulas for a film industry that hadn't yet asked for them. He built a building whose design expressed a theory of beauty when a warehouse would have served the functional purpose more cheaply. He was obsessive and particular and probably difficult to work with, and every one of those qualities was necessary to produce what he produced. The companies that followed him were rational. They had processes and frameworks and quarterly earnings targets. They could not have built Max Factor. They could only inherit it, spend it, and sell the remainder. The building in the afternoon light drive north on Highland Avenue from Hollywood Boulevard. In the late afternoon, when the sun is low enough to hit the building's western face at an angle, the terracotta tiles still catch the light. For a moment, before you register the security fencing, the dark windows, the accumulated grime, you can see what the building was meant to be. Serious and beautiful simultaneously. A place where science and vanity were treated as equally legitimate pursuits. A monument to the conviction that the work of making people feel beautiful was worth doing with obsessive precision, worth documenting, worth commemorating in pink terracotta and geometric patterns that still catch the light correctly. After 90 years. Inside, preservation groups have documented what remains: stripped walls, removed fixtures, The ghost outlines of the color-coded rooms visible in the different patinas left on the floor, where walls once stood. The blonde room, the brunette room, the redhead room, gone as functional spaces, present as outlines. The building was landmarked in 2012, which means it cannot be demolished, but also cannot be compelled into any particular use. It exists in a legal category that protects its shell while offering no guidance about its soul. Various proposals have circulated over the years. A makeup museum seemed obvious but proved economically unviable. There isn't enough tourist interest in cosmetics history to support the operating costs of a standalone institution. In one of Los Angeles's most expensive real estate corridors, a professional makeup school would honor the building's original purpose, but faces the same economics. Luxury residential conversion would pay the bills, but sits awkwardly against the building's history. Nothing has happened. The building waits. Former Max Factor employees, the ones who worked there in the 1960s and 1970s, before the decline became undeniable, have organized informal preservation efforts. They have collected artifacts, vintage product containers, internal technical documents, correspondence between Factor's sons and the studio makeup departments they supplied, photographs of the consultation rooms when they were still in use. Some of this material has been donated to the Academy Film Archive. Most sits in private collections, waiting for an institution that will give it proper context. The people who remember what Max Factor meant, who worked there when the Highland Avenue building was a functioning center of the beauty industry, who knew the makeup artists who had worked directly with the stars, who understood in their bones the difference between what Max Factor was and what it became, are aging out of the conversation. Within another decade, the living memory will be gone. What will remain is documentation, product labels, trade advertisements, technical specifications, the occasional surviving bottle or compact that surfaces in an estate sale and finds its way to someone who understands what they're holding. Maksymilian Faktorowicz arrived in America carrying formulas he had developed in a military posting in Moscow that had taught him how to solve a problem that didn't yet fully exist. He built a company that changed what movies looked like and changed what it meant for an ordinary woman to consider wearing makeup. He built it by caring about his work with an intensity that his successors could not replicate, because they had not grown up compounding cosmetics in a pharmacist's back room, had not spent years solving the problem of how to keep a face looking human under lights hot enough to damage skin. The building stands. The brand persists, technically, in British pharmacies and Russian supermarkets. The products and the culture that justified both are gone. What remains is what always remains when something genuinely excellent disappears: the absence of it, which is its own kind of presence. The collectors who pay significant prices for vintage Max Factor compacts on eBay. The beauty editors who explain to younger readers that the framework they use to think about professional-grade cosmetics was invented by a Polish immigrant in a building that has been empty for more than a decade. The makeup artists working in film today who use techniques developed on this specific block, in these specific rooms, by a man whose name they may not recognize. There's a version of this story that could have gone differently. Not easily. The market forces that eroded Max Factor's position were real and structural, and not easily reversed. But imagine a buyer in 1991 who understood prestige beauty the way LVMH understands it, who would have done what seems obvious in retrospect: pulled the brand out of mass distribution immediately, taken the short-term revenue hit, rebuilt from the Highland Avenue building outward, hired real makeup artists as creative directors, not as consultants, priced for prestige and defended that pricing, made Max Factor the original again, not through nostalgia marketing, but through genuine innovation. That honored the founder's obsession. That buyer didn't materialize. What materialized was P&G, which brought everything to the table except the one thing that mattered: the willingness to be irrational about quality in the way that Max Factor Sr. had been irrational about it. Some things, once lost, cannot be recovered. Not because recovery is technically impossible, but because the specific conditions that produce them, the person, the moment, the particular combination of obsession and circumstance and timing, exist only once. Max Factor existed once. What's left is the empty building, the diminished brand, and the language he created, which everyone in the beauty industry still speaks, without knowing where it came from or what it cost to invent.